Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Hey everyone, Mike here. Thanks so much to all of you who gave me feedback on my first food politics post. That was the one on the politics of avocados. And from what you said, many of you at least, would like to hear more of these sort of short podcast episodes. And also that you would like them to stay with the Politics Guys so you don't have a whole nother podcast to add to what I'm sure is for most of you a long list. So I'm happy to do that. And so with no further ado, here is my second effort at this, the politics of farm labor. Now, last time I looked at how trade policy helped the avocado become really hot fruit in the produce section. Now, one problem with the surging demand for avocados in recent years is that they're not really easy to harvest. Every single avocado has to be picked off of a tree by hand. Now, for some other fruits and nuts, there are these tree shaking machines, like for almonds and cherries. Well, they don't work for avocados because even on the same tree, avocados often mature at different rates, and so you want to get them all when they're at, the same maturity level. Now, another reason why picking mechanically isn't an option is just basically with the nature of avocados. You think about an avocado, it's a pretty big, heavy thing, and avocado trees go anywhere from 15 to 30 feet up. Well, you can kind of see where this is going, right? An avocado falls from the tree and boom, you have a bruised avocado. That really wouldn't work out so well. So, in other words, they have to all be done by hand. It's very labor intensive. And so when you combine increased demand and this very labor intensive nature of harvesting, it can make it really difficult for avocado producers to find enough people to bring in the crop. For instance, according to a survey from 2017 from the California Farm Bureau, 69% of growers with seasonal workforces have employee shortages, with these shortages being most acute for fruit trees like avocado. It's a fruit tree. Now, growers also said that the overall skill level of their workforce is also an issue. And so what that means is when you have lower skilled workers that need more training, that means increased harvesting time and in some cases, even crops that aren't being fully harvested. In fact, nearly half of the growers that were surveyed said they'd been offering higher wages, better benefits, or other incentives in an attempt to try to attract better, more skilled, more motivated workforces. Now, the avocado, harvesting workforce is almost, well, not exclusively, but it's very strongly, overwhelmingly, in fact, immigrant-based. Now, according to Department of Labor stats, 80% of hired farm workers are Hispanic, and only 31% of all hired farm workers are U.S. citizens. Now, this just isn't for avocados, but for farm workers in general. Now, Mexico, as you might guess, is far and away the main supplier of this immigrant labor. In fact, 68% of all hired farm workers in the U.S. were born in Mexico. Only 21% are permanent legal residents, and only 53% have work authorization. In other words, what I'm saying here is nearly half of the entire agricultural workforce in the United States is made up of undocumented immigrants. That's really kind of mind-blowing, at least as far as I'm concerned. Now, starting pay for these workers, it's typically around $12 to $13 or so per hour. But, this is not a simple, easy work. This is long days, back-breaking labor. They rarely get any benefits. And the conditions they live in are, I guess you'd call them squalid. And they live there throughout the harvest season. Now, there are over 1 million of these jobs in the United States, but because of the combination of low pay, minimal benefits, and these rough working conditions, well, this is the kind of work that's very unattractive to most Americans. One grower said, "There's no way we can take care of and pick our crop without immigrant labor." Now, some people, of course, don't buy this. They say, well, when the economy gets bad and there aren't that many jobs around, Americans will gladly take agricultural jobs. But The problem, and this argument kind of goes forward, is that, well, because you have immigrants doing these jobs, that locks U.S. workers out of this farm labor market. Well, there was a case study done on this using data from 2011. This was in North Carolina. The North Carolina Growers Association did it. And they were curious to see if this kind of held up. Well, that year, and this was a year in which unemployment in North Carolina was right around 10%, the North Carolina Growers Association posted 6,500 farm job listings. Now, at that level of unemployment, at around 10%, which was even higher in the rural areas where most of these jobs were based, you would think that there would be, a good deal of interest from unemployed North Carolinians. But that turned out not to be the case. There's some really amazing numbers here. There were only 268 U.S. citizens who even bothered to apply for any of these jobs. Now, 245 of them were hired, 91%. So basically, if a U.S. citizen more or less wanted one of these jobs, they were hired for the job. But only 163 of them showed up for work on the first day. And then move over to a month later, half of those people had quit. And by the end of the growing season, there were only 7 left. That's 7 left. That's a dropout rate of 95.5%. So what was the dropout rate for Mexican workers? 10%. And as one of the authors of the study wrote, no matter how bad the economy becomes, Native workers do not take farm jobs. Now, it's true, it's only one study, but that lines up with a lot of things anecdotally that producers have been saying for a long time now. Now, the most common type of work permit for seasonal farm laborers who are in the country legally is something called an H-2A visa, and over 134,000 of them were issued in 2016. The H-2A program was created back in 1986 as a way for businesses to temporarily bring in immigrant agricultural labor just for the growing season. Now, businesses that want to employ H-2A workers first have to demonstrate that they have repeatedly tried and failed to attract full-time U.S. residents for the jobs that they need to fill. And if they can do that, and honestly, generally it's not too difficult to make that case, then they have to deal with multiple state and federal agencies as well as the U.S. Embassy of the immigrant employees. In addition to that, employers have to find the workers, arrange for their transportation to and from their home country, make sure they have meals and housing, and ensure they have a way to get back and forth to work. So in other words, that's quite a lot of a burden. And a lot of businesses have really struggled with navigating this process. In fact, so much so that kind of a cottage industry of H-2A visa advisors has sprung up. In fact, I was able to talk to one of these advisors, and I asked her if this, really kind of Byzantine, confusing process might actually push producers, especially small producers, into hiring undocumented workers, and they don't have to go through all that with undocumented workers. And she said, I think that happens all the time. That's what the majority of employers are doing. In addition, she also pointed out that businesses that try to do the right thing and go through the legitimate H-2A program, they open themselves up to Department of Labor investigations. And so, ironically, farms that hire undocumented laborers are often more insulated from an investigation because they kind of fly under the radar because there's no employment paper trail on file with the federal government. Now, the workforce that's made up largely of immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal, most of whom are very poorly educated and oftentimes have little or no English language skills, well, that's a workforce that is tailor-made for exploitation. And undocumented workers rarely speak out because, well, if they're here illegally, they fear deportation. And even workers who are here with H-2A visas are at risk because their residency in the U.S., their legal status in the U.S. is tied to their employer. So if they're fired, they can't look for another job. They're prohibited from doing that. They're sent home or they remain in the country illegally. Now, there have been several independent investigations of this whole system, and what they found is rampant exploitation of immigrant farm workers. Common abuses of workers include withholding pay, not paying overtime, intentionally under-recording time worked, confiscating visas, prohibiting workers from leaving the farm, and even intimidation, harassment, and sexual abuse. And this isn't just independent investigations, this is also the federal government. In 2015, the Government Accountability Office reported that from 2009 through 2013, 866 H-2A visa employers were in violation of one or more legally mandated worker protection, and the vast majority of these were related to worker pay. And the report also found that violations may be underreported, again because, not surprisingly, workers fear retaliation, deportation, as well as blacklisting. Now, technically, businesses that violate immigrant farm worker rights can be banned from the H-2A visa program for a period of time. But in reality, this rarely happens because the statute of limitations is only 2 years. Now, that's not 2 years from the time between an alleged violation and when a complaint's filed, but 2 years between the violation and the conclusion of a Department of Labor investigation. And according to the Government Accountability Office, the median length of investigations that Department of Labor did from 2009 through 2014 was 24 months, 2 years. In other words, here's what I'm saying. Half of all the investigations that were done about potential abuses went on longer than the statute of limitations. So even if they found violations, violators couldn't be banned from the program because the statute of limitations had run out. That's crazy, right? Now, and even if a business is debarred from the H-2A visa program, that doesn't necessarily stop it from bringing in immigrant workers. If you're a business and you're kicked out of this program, oftentimes all you have to do is make a small change to your name and reapply. Now, you might think, how could that work? Because you can change the name of your farm, right? But you can't just move it down the road to a different address. Well, the problem is that while the Department of Labor does check new H-2A visa applications against what they have called a debarred list, the automatic check at this point only includes business names, not addresses, which again seems nuts to me. Now, if employment of undocumented workers is rampant in agriculture, and we know that it is, you might ask, well, why hasn't the government cracked down on this? Well, one reason is that it can be difficult to prove that an employer has knowingly hired an undocumented worker. Now, employers are required to check papers, as sometimes they put it, on workers, but thanks to a pretty thriving fake immigration document business, that's not so much of a barrier. Now, hey, employers know that many of these documents are bogus, but it's clearly in their economic interest to not look all that closely. Now, all employers have access to a federal system called E-Verify, which allows them to check job applicant documents against government records. But even though E-Verify has been around for about 2 decades, it still remains voluntary in 41 states. And in the 9 states that do mandate it, enforcement ranges from, you could say, spotty to just about non-existent. Now, President Trump has called on Congress to make E-Verify mandatory nationwide, and initially there was some talk of including mandatory E-Verify in the legislation that was intended to replace President Obama's executive order on deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA. But at this point, it doesn't look like Senate negotiators are interested in making E-Verify mandatory. And so there is some congressional support for a mandatory check program through E-Verify. There's also bipartisan opposition. There are many groups, in fact, on the left that are concerned about privacy and data errors, and those are somewhat legitimate concerns, while some on the right feel that E-Verify is, once again, big brother federal government intruding on businesses. And then finally, there's, I guess you would call it the elephant in the room. If we have a farm labor system that's based on underpaid and exploited immigrant workers, well, that system keeps costs way down. Now, the federal government could absolutely enact immigrant labor reform that would minimize to a great extent the hiring of undocumented workers and dramatically improve the lives of agricultural workers who are in this country legally. But providing workers with decent wages and working conditions, that would impose big cost on these businesses. And what would these businesses do? They wouldn't eat those costs, right? They would, of course, pass most of these costs along to American consumers. So, many Americans say they care about immigrant labor abuse. At least I think most Americans probably do, and they certainly would if they saw some of these conditions. But do they care enough to pay $3 or $4 for an avocado? Unfortunately, I don't think so. That's it for this Food Politics episode. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I would love to get your comments, critiques, any ideas that you have for future shows. Just send them to mike@politicsguys.com.